The Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty, you can see, it seems like Europe and China are very similar, sort of lockstep in development, that the whole world seems to go at the same rate. And we have the Pantheon and the Colosseum are happening right at the same time as the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty dates are from about 206 to 220. The capital of the Han Dynasty was Xi'an. And the Han Dynasty seems to be built on what had been established by the Qin Dynasty. It seems to be an age of enlightenment, almost a renaissance in a way, because Confucianism is restored. And an interesting element is Buddhism is introduced, which has to do with reincarnation and with a sort of enlightened point of view. And that ties in with Taoism a little bit. The Silk Road is established, and we're going to look at two tombs from this era, the tomb of Prince Liu Shang and the tomb of Prince Lady Dai, who is the wife of the Marquis of Dai. Lady Dai probably died around 180, maybe 200 AD at around 41 years of age. So this is a reconstruction of some of the things that were found in the tomb and what she might have been dressed in, and some of the prestige items, like, for instance, the lacquer objects that were in her tomb as well. She actually died when she was in her 40s, probably 41 or 45, something like that. And she died actually from a heart attack, and we're going to discuss that in a little bit more depth in a minute. The tomb was originally found as a mound. And when they excavated the mound, they did it using modern archaeological methods called stratigraphy. And stratigraphy basically means that what you do is you divide the tomb area up into a grid, and you dig down very carefully into small squared-off grid-like areas. Once you dig down and you make sure that you are able to see what comes in the layers before, and you carefully sift through the soil, you get down to the actual tomb itself, and you can see the tomb is kind of divided up into pockets, and there's a coffin in the middle of it. The tomb, or the coffin itself, was surrounded by layers of clay and charcoal. And this actually preserved the body really well. So if you look, it was actually kind of like a series of Russian dolls, where the coffins were set one into another, and we have the series of coffins that were layered up. Each of the coffins was almost like those Russian dolls that you find one inside the other, and they made it out of lacquered wood. The coffins were the same way, and they were heavily decorated. And lacquer, if you recall, is the sap of a tree that actually can seal it from moisture, almost like today's modern polyurethane. And so the body was completely preserved. So they did a sort of CSI autopsy on her, and what they found when they did this autopsy on her was that she died of heart disease or a heart attack. An interesting sort of component, she doesn't look very good here, but they found out that she had sciatica and had to walk with a cane. I think that they found some pork in her stomach that was undigested. They found that she had gout and had all kinds of digestive issues. And I think they also even found some mercury, which was used as a drug at the time that relates to Taoist chemicals. So they knew a lot about her, and they also found some of the prestige, the lacquered items, the pots, and some musical instruments, as you recall from other tombs that we've looked at, that the bells and music are important to funerals. The most important item they found in the tomb was a banner, or a sort of silk gown that might have been worn by her. It was found draped over the lid of the innermost coffin, so it was really pretty well preserved. Unfortunately, the color sort of fades out, and it's hard to get a really good reproduction of it. So I also have a diagram that I'm going to be trading back and forth with so that you can kind of see what it looks like. The inventory records record it, and the inventory was written on bamboo strips that we saw in other tombs, and they refer to the garment as a flying garment or a flying gown. And it may have been carried as sort of a banner in a funerary procession. It may have been used to relate to shamanistic practices to call the soul back, which is one of the rituals in Taoist ceremony, that the living can actually call the soul and ask it to live with the living and help it out. So we have an element of ancestor worship that relates somewhat to Confucianism, but please remember, Confucianism is a philosophy, not a religion. The iconography of it overall might represent the journey of Lady Di into the afterlife. It's kind of a diagram of the spirit world, and in some ways can relate to the ideas found in Taoism. We find in the bottommost layer a sort of netherworld that is... It's not hell, it's just kind of a weird, spooky underworld. And if you relate this somewhat to Mayan art, you could see it as a sort of Xibalba-like world where it's not necessarily hell, but it's also not heaven. It's another spirit world. And it's not necessarily where the dead go either. Above that is a zone that's sort of a transitional zone that becomes our world. And then above that are the heavens. And we find that they're actually, the sun and the moon are represented in there. So we're going to start with the bottommost layer. And what I want you to do is take a look at it in its arrangement. It's kind of a hierarchy where heaven is at the top and the sort of the almost not negative, but weird netherworld or the spirit world, the dark spirit world is on the bottom. And in the bottommost layer, you have snakes. There's some sort of aquatic scene. There's a kind of ogre creature that's holding up a plinth or an entablature-like structure. And as you move above it, you move a little bit more into the world of men. And the world of men is kind of our world in a way. And people are sitting beneath a great chime, surrounded by bronze vessels, with Lady Di's coffin in the center. Above that, sort of moving into a sort of spiritual world, you have a human-headed bird or two human-headed birds. And this is very similar to Egyptian mythology and Egyptian representations of creatures that are supernatural, where it's a compound creature, the head of a bird or the head of a person and the body of a bird. So I guess it can fly into the heavens, into the afterworld. And above that is the image of a dragon. And dragons somewhat relate to water and relate to this creature that can leap up into the heavens. And the dragons are intertwined with a disc that relates, it's called a bee disc, and you can see them made out of jade an awful lot and might represent the sun. And you can also relate that probably in some ways to a sort of Jungian or transcendent symbol of eternity. A circle is a symbol that keeps going on forever. If you think of the cheesy movie The Lion King, the circle of life, that circles are like domes of heaven and they are continuous and eternal. If we look above that, we start moving into this sort of transitional world that's kind of heaven and kind of our world, in which we find Lady Di. She's wearing her banner and she's leaning on a cane. And in front of her and behind her are a retinue. In front of her are probably the subjects or messengers asking her to come back, or these are the souls of her descendants who are making supplication or honoring her in some way. It might relate somewhat to the calling back of the souls in that way. And behind her are her retinue or entourage, her advisors. Heaven seems to be seated on the back of two dragons that are intertwined with the bee. And so we find, again, there's a relationship to that Joe banner we looked at of the shaman riding up into the heavens on the back of a dragon. And we're going to see other representations of dragons that really flesh out the vision of the dragon that we saw from the Joe banner. Above Lady Di is a bell, and to the right of the bell, and in sort of one of the sleeve-like structures, is the raven who's sitting in the sun. And you can see that there are actually, I think, 9 circles up there, and that relates somewhat to the tale of Raven and Archer Yi. And in a nutshell, the tale works like this. There were these 9 sons that were actually ravens, and they acted up and they acted naughty. And they all decided to come out at once, even though they were supposed to switch positions one a day. And since they were burning up the planet itself, Archer Yi was called in, who's kind of a hero in a way. He's not always so positive, but he is a warrior hero, and he comes along, sort of like this archer from the Qin Dynasty, and he shoots down 8 of the suns and leaves 1 up there, and that's the raven that's left. And so that's how we get the raven and the sun. This could also relate to Kwakiutl and Haida and North American mythology of how the raven stole the sun. It's kind of interesting that the raven is associated with the planets several times. To the left of that is the moon and a toad and the rabbit. And the rabbit sits on the moon grinding this elixir of immortality, and it's kind of a Beauty and the Beast kind of story, or the prince and the toad, the princess and the toad story. The toad is a beautiful goddess who tried to steal this elixir from the rabbit and was made into a frog or a toad for sort of transgressing for her troubles. In the center above that might be the fire god with a dragon, and that might also be Lady Di in the center of that. So we're not sure if it's a dragon, if it's Lady Di, or the fire god, and she's in the center of it. So if we look at this banner from a formal point of view and sort of zoom in a little bit on some of the details and look at how things are represented, first of all, the materials that were used, it's made out of silk and mineral that was made into a dye, and it was dyed sort of a terracotta kind of red. Red is also found a little bit on her body, and we find that red is used in funerary practices around the planet, actually. If you recall the Venus of Willendorf that had some red ochre on it, Neanderthal people had red sprinkled on some of their bodies in the prehistoric tombs. It's done in a very diagrammatic way. So we have these sort of outlines, and then so it's the outline and fill-in technique that we looked at from the Job banner earlier. And in a way, it shows a little bit more individual portrait painting, so it's a little bit more specific, but there is no space being created other than slight overlapping of the figures. So we've got this sort of no background, no middle ground. Everything seems to be pushed up against the front of the picture plane. So stylistically, it's kind of even lines. There's no real thin or thickness too much in the lines. There's a little bit of gesture, but not too much illusionism going on in it. So there's a little bit of overlapping. Now, the fact that this was found in a tomb relates to Confucianism and relates somewhat to Taoist ideas and a little bit about Buddhism, because there might have been some concepts of reincarnation involved in this.